opinions.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Extreme radio for extreme times. This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640. Toronto Radio.
I want to welcome you in if you're driving around town, listening to your radio, or if you're at work with your radio just now getting turned up on AM 640 Toronto Radio. Also, I want to welcome you in if you're listening on Star Choice on Channel 865, or if you're at the Primo spot, the El Numero Uno spot to listen to A View from Space, sitting in front of your Mac or your PC at home, logged on to 640toronto.com, picking up the live audio streaming. Wherever you are in the world, I welcome you in. First time I've ever opened my mouth for any length of time about UFOs. It will be now. See, human beings have been seeing strange things in the skies since, well, the dawn of history, really. But, did you know this? The idea that they are actually technologically advanced devices is pretty recent. They were first called X devices, although that word to describe them isn't used anymore. You know why it was originally X, don't you? X marked the man who took the left path. Cain. The mark of Cain is an X or a stylized cross, whichever you prefer. And that's why UFOs were called, in the very, very first instance, X devices. Just like the alien beings are called extraterrestrials. The first actual person to even suggest that mysterious objects and lights in the sky might be machines from another planet was probably the great American anomalist Charles Fort. He lived from 1874 to 1932. But it wasn't until the late 40s that the idea began to catch on. Late 40s will put you right after the Second World War, which is very telling. There was this famous sighting by a pilot named Kenneth Arnold over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, June 24th, 1947. Ever since that event, the UFO mystery has never, ever gone away. As a matter of fact, it has grown now to the point where more and more people begin to buy into the fact that there must be more intelligent life somewhere out there in outer space. Since then, there was an entirely new mindset that was propagated by the Illuminati-controlled media. That it must be true. That there must be other intelligent beings, if not in this universe, in another universe. They've made sure through their propaganda and brainwashing, through books, television, countless television shows, and movies, that have given the impression that this phenomenon certainly has never been adequately explained to everybody's satisfaction. Actually, it's now more deeply ingrained into the public consciousness than ever before. And as a matter of fact, the flying saucer can really be described as one of the great cultural icons of the 20th century. Skeptics will argue that the reason for this mixture of wishful thinking or just misidentification of ordinary phenomena in the skies and out-and-out hoaxes, because there are those, but I think, personally, the truth of the matter is more subtle and more complex than it appears. Oh, it's certainly true that approximately 95% of sightings can be attributed to stars, planets, meteorites, satellites, aircraft, reflections, things like that. But what about the other 5% that can't be explained away so easily? Just look back at one of the classic UFO sightings from the early days of modern UFOlogy. And there are many impressive sightings from the 90s. They are still the subject of intense debate, and I believe it's much more conservative, err on the safe side, to choose a sighting that has stood the test of time. A sighting that is still regarded as certainly the most genuine. And it was on May 11th, 1950, that it happened at 7:45 in the evening. That has just passed, May 11th and the time of evening. Mr. and Mrs. Paul Trent watched a large object fly over their farm near McMinnville, Oregon, in the States. Evelyn Trent, Paul's wife, was out feeding their rabbits when she noticed this UFO in the sky, this unidentified flying object. She called her husband, Paul, who was able to take a couple of black and white photographs of it. The photograph showed a circular object with a flat undersurface and a beveled edge. Extending from the upper surface of the object was this strange piece that looked a lot like a submarine conning tower. You know, the submarines have those little towers sitting on the top, which was not straight up and down, perpendicular, but was slightly tilted. The object in the sky was a bright, silvery object, and it moved across the sky in absolute silence. And then it went out of sight. The Trents later said that they had a slight breeze on their skin from the underside of the UFO as it passed through. It must have been pretty low. The Trents never went after any publicity after the sighting. In fact, they waited until they used up the rest of their film that was in their camera before having the photographs, the entire roll, developed. I mean, that's how conservative these two farmers from Oregon were. They shot the rest of their film that was in their camera, shots left, before they went to get it developed. And they mentioned the incident to only a few friends, but news of the sighting quickly spread to a reporter from the local McMinnville Telephone Register newspaper, the small-town newspaper, who visited the Trents and was given the photographic evidence, actually a couple of negatives. A week later, the photographs appeared in Life magazine and became world famous. 17 years later, I pick up the story when I get back. It's AM 640, Toronto Radio. It's the Spaceman on A View from Space, just getting started with the mystery of UFOs.
Deeper into today's headlines than anyone else dares to go. But can you take it? This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
I'm Space, it's AM 640, Toronto Radio. Welcome to A View from Space. Just getting started on the mystery of UFOs. 57 years ago, the most important event in UFO history happened in McMinnville when a local farmer and his wife captured evidence of interplanetary visitors on film. Or they merely snapped a couple of pictures of a still secret military aircraft. Or maybe it was an optical illusion. Or maybe it was a hoax. Even after 57 years, nobody yet knows what to make of the two photographs taken by Paul and Evelyn Trent. A bit after dinner, May 11th, 1950, and a lot's been made of the photographs. What set the Trents' photographs apart wasn't the timing. They weren't the first photos purporting to show unidentified flying objects, and they've hardly been the last. There's been a lot of events like it, but this was of particular interest because of the clarity of the photos. Bruce Maccabee, a researcher who has performed exhaustive analysis, said, without the photos it would have been just another sighting by some people, but the Trent case stands out because the photos are so clear that it's either the real thing or a very incredibly well-contrived hoax by a couple of farmers. Beyond the relative clarity of the photos, though, it was the Trents themselves who really set the photos apart. Both Paul and Evelyn died in the late 90s. The house where the photographs were taken has long since been torn down, but the Trents were pretty much simple farm folk from Oregon. They weren't the sort of people like some who either imagine or make up a flying saucer story. Maccabee, a researcher, spent hours interviewing them over several years while he studied the photographs. He says he basically concluded that they were not the type of people who would attempt a UFO hoax, to say nothing of pulling one off. That conclusion was echoed by Bill Powell, a journalist who showed the Trent photographs to the world and touched off a media circus decades before that term came into use, common use, UFO. Working for the telephone register of the small little newspaper, Powell got word of the photos in June of 1950. They'd been taken a whole month earlier. There were two of them. He retrieved the negatives from Paul Trent and published them across the top of the telephone register newspaper and told the Trent story. Evelyn Trent was feeding rabbits in the backyard at their Ballston area farm when she saw this flying disc in the sky to the northwest. She called for her husband, Paul. Look! Paul went and got a camera, snapped a photograph, two of them, with his Kodak camera. We wound the film as quickly as possible and snapped another shot 30 seconds later. Both photos appear to show a disc sliding through the sky. Paul Trent may have had photos of the biggest news story ever to hit McMinnville, but all he did was put the camera away. Later, after finishing off the roll of film on Mother's Day, he took it to a drugstore in McMinnville's 3rd Street to be developed. He says, the reason I thought they were authentic was the negatives were in the middle of the roll, says Powell from his retirement home in Idaho Falls, Idaho. He'd taken some more pictures so that he'd make sure he got his money's worth when he developed the things. Powell was the man who developed the pictures. Maccabee said the story was part of why the photographs had taken on such an importance in the UFO movement. If the Trents had been trying to fake a photograph, they'd likely have taken several practice shots and shown the world only the best take of what they ended up with. The other thing that makes the photos believable is that the Trents didn't seem to be trying to take advantage of anyone or get publicity. The day Paul Trent got the film developed, he told banker Ralph Wortman about it. Wortman, a friend of his, mentioned it to the telephone register editor, Bladine, who put Powell on the case to go investigate. And when they put it in the small-town newspaper in Oregon, of course, the big city boys got a hold of it, and they appeared in Life magazine, the nation's top circulation magazine, published them in July of 1950. The Mutual Broadcasting System, Frank Edwards, their top personality, got a copy of the telephone register and called Bladine and said, "Your paper's a dime." Edwards said to Bladine, "Can I tell people that if they send you a dime, you'll send them a copy?" He says, "Sure," figuring he might get a request for 3 or 4 papers. Instead, requests flooded in. Dimes came in, taped to cards, wrapped in paper. Some payment was made in stamps. Sometimes dollar bills were sent. Multiple copies were requested. The telephone register's headline the next week reported, "Saucer's top story in U.S. Inquirers flood telephone register's office." They were inundated. And that was the headline of the next week. We got inundated with the saucer story from last week in our paper. The Trents were eventually invited to New York for a radio appearance, of course. And the photos have been reprinted many times. They were included in the Condon Report, a University of Colorado study conducted into UFO sightings on behalf of the United States Air Force even. But when it was all said and done, that was the most believable sighting and proof ever of an unidentified flying object. As I said, they mentioned it to only a few friends, and a week later, the world knew. 17 years later, the McMinnville UFO sighting was investigated by that group I've just mentioned, the Condon Report, investigated by William Hartman, who was included in the now famous Condon Report produced by the United States Air Force, sponsored by the Colorado University Commission of Inquiry. The Condon Report, by the way, was named after the inquiry's leader, who was then a highly respected physicist named Dr. Edward Condon. The report completely dismissed the UFO phenomenon, which it considered to be of no interest at all to science. But the report did state a few cases of UFO sightings that it conceded was unexplainable. Couldn't explain it by any logical explanation. And one of these cases was the Trent's McMinnville, Oregon sighting. Hartman says the photographs were submitted to extremely rigorous scientific analysis. When the tests were over, he concluded, this is one of the few UFO reports in which all factors investigated, geometric, psychological, physical, appear to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object, silvery in color, metallic, disc-shaped, tens of meters in diameter, and evidently artificial, flew within sight of these two witnesses. He said it can't be said that the evidence positively rules out fabrication, although there are some physical factors like the accuracy of certain photometric measures of the original negatives which argue against fabrication. In the 57 years since the Trents had their strange encounter, the photographs have been repeatedly subjected to more and more sophisticated analyses and have passed every test. This case is just one of quite a few sightings of highly unusual, apparently intelligently guided objects, seen both in the skies and on the ground, and have been occurring for decades. And of course there are various theories to account for these sightings. Some are hoaxes, some aren't. Some are also illusions or misidentifications of ordinary phenomena. But there is these few that look genuine. I firmly believe in UFOs, but they're not from out of this world. More in a moment. AM 640, Toronto Radio. It's the Spaceman. This is A View from Space.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio. Extreme radio for extreme times. This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640 Toronto Radio.
I'm the Spaceman, and this is A View from Space. It's AM 640 Toronto Radio. I've occasionally, on past shows, mentioned UFOs, and that UFOs well, you're looking at the enemy is us. See, I don't believe that there is extraterrestrial life. I believe we're alone in the universes. I believe that someone called the Illuminati, who are the elite rich, the bloodlines that are descended from Cain, that have passed through the leadership of all of the empires on this earth, and like smart money, they move to the next empire and are the leaders in that one. So each time an empire falls, a new one comes in its place, and it's the same people, the same bloodline. I firmly believe that. So I believe that when man could run around on the earth, he put a gun on it. When man could go underwater or float on the water, he put a gun on it. When man could go into the air, he put a gun on it. When man could get into near outer space, he put a gun on it. All designed to, are you ready? Enslave you. To place a new world order, a one world government in place. It's been called the Great Work. They're very close to having it happen. The plan is 3 world wars. To make it so abysmal, so grotesque war, that you will never, ever want to experience it again, and will accept anything to stop it. So, outer space, putting a gun on it, leads us to the reason why the UFO phenomenon. Now, there are 2 widely accepted theories. The most widely accepted in North America, of course, is what's called the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which proposes that the genuine UFOs are spacecraft piloted by explorers from another planet. This theory is most believed by, as I've said, people in North America. Again, as I've already mentioned, it's due to the brainwashing by books, but mostly by television shows and movies continuously put in front of you since the 50s. Now just think. Before the 1950s, nobody believed that UFOs even existed. And you were considered a crazy person who was not to be trusted, and even to the point of being dangerous to yourself and others. You were someone who had totally lost it. Believe me, before the 50s, you were a crazy. You were called a tinfoil head. Protecting yourself from radio waves from other worlds. But after the 50s, if you didn't believe in UFOs, it reversed totally, a total reversal. If you didn't believe in the UFOs, you were considered almost naive. Not just naive, but even closed-minded to think that humans were the only intelligent beings in the universe, and to think that it wasn't possible that there might even be an inkling of a possibility of another species more intelligent than man out there would be preposterous. So the 50s was a very, very pivotal situation in time to change people's minds from totally disbelieving in UFOs to totally believing them. It didn't take long. But I want you to know there was a time where no one accepted that fact of a UFO. Now, in Europe, it's a little different. They tend to believe another theory. It's known as the psychosocial hypothesis, which suggests that encounters with UFOs and aliens may be due to subtle and misunderstood processes occurring within the mind of the human being. Sort of getting into the spiritual realm here. See, Europe is a much older society. And remember, in the 30s, the Rosicrucians actually sold an entire country called Germany on a super race. Forget about the Bible. That was last week's show. Forget about the Bible. Here is a replacement for what the Bible says is the truth. And they bought it, lock, stock, and barrel, enough to put Hitler in as chancellor. And, of course, it didn't hurt to have the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War, handing the bill to the Germans for the First World War reparations. It just set up the Second World War. But there was also a mindset that came with it, and it was called, we are better than you. Driving the wedge in. That's how it's done with the Illuminati. It's the Hegelian dialectic. Pit one side against the other. Create the chaos to get the change. The change to? One step closer to a one-world government. So this subtle process called psychosocial hypothesis in Europe came from the mind of one man, spread by one man, the Swiss psychoanalyst Karl G. Jung, who looked at UFOs in his book, Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky, published in 1959, right at the end of the 50s. The psychosociologists see close encounters with UFOs as similar to waking dreams that fulfill an undefined psychic need. In other words, they want to see God. No, they want to see God. They want to see a different kind of God, though. They want to see it spiritually, but it's not the Christian. It's not the Islamic God. It's not the Jewish God. It's Lucifer. To Jung, you see, The circular shape of the UFO suggested a psychic need for wholeness and unity, represented by the mandala, a circular symbol identified by Karl Jung as one of the archetypes residing in humanity's collective unconsciousness. And I've stated many times on A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio that the symbol for the sun is the circle, which is the shape of the sun. The Illuminati are responsible for both beliefs. Back with more in a minute. It's the Spaceman. The mystery of UFOs revealed tonight on A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio.
Deprogramming the brainwashed simply by uncovering the truth. He's the Spaceman with A View from Space, AM 640 Toronto Radio.
The guy they call Space, it's AM 640 Toronto Radio. Talking about UFOs, the mystery of UFOs. I'll reveal it tonight as my opinion. I mean, after all, it is a view from space. So, two views, really. The extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is highly believed in North America, and that is the fact that spacecraft are piloted by explorers from another planet. In Europe, it's a little bit more cerebral. It's called the psychosociologist hypothesis. It's occurring in the mind of the human being, trying to fulfill an undefined psychic need, says the founder of the thought process, Karl Jung, a Swiss psychoanalyst. Switzerland, by the way, is the home of the Illuminati, and you would not expect anything other than Luciferianism to come out of it. He connects the circular shape of the UFO because the circle is the sign of the sun, and these people are sun worshippers. That's why they're called the Illuminati. They're enlightened. And the Illuminati are responsible for both these beliefs. The extraterrestrials manning these or alienating these spaceships, and also for the mind game that Europe firmly believes. I believe they have a technology that they have occasionally shown to the so-called witnesses, the physical or material side of this manifestation, and they also weave the black magic spell too, that is the spiritual side. There are also responsibilities lying for all of the theories for UFOs, including the idea that there are time machines from the future, that they're actually living beings indigenous to interplanetary space, that they originate in other dimensions of existence, and things like that. In these theories, they're all leading you to the place where they always lead you, into demon worship. Those dimensions of existence are, in fact, the world of demons. They are the angels that sided with Lucifer in the war against the true God and became his minions, his lieutenants, his spirits who do his bidding. I believe that UFOs are man-made, based on actual plans salvaged from the ruins of Nazi Germany at the end of the Second World War. The Illuminati controlled both sides of World War II, so all the research and development was theirs. When the world is in a state of war, you can test out your new engine, your new gun. See how it works. All your killing inventions can be tested right there on the battlefield. For instance, Hitler's research teams came up with the first jet engine. He was also working on an atomic bomb, just as the English and Americans were. What a fascinating topic on A View from Space not long back on AM 640 Toronto Radio, on how they actually kept the hands out of the atomic bomb out of the hands of Adolf Hitler. He was as close as Oppenheimer almost, and sabotaged each time he got to the second last or last step. Through the control of the Illuminati of both sides, the weapons inventions were perfected and carried out over to the next conflict that they would start. For instance, the jet was conceived in World War II and used as the main weapon in the next war, the Korean War. The Korean War saw the Sabre jet. The technology was perfected, the jet engine. Technology of the atom bomb ended World War II, and World War III will be opened with it. It's the same format used in what was called the Cold War, the war that pitted Russian technology against America with British technology, giving us the ability to travel near space. Notice this. Listen carefully to me. The Russians' part of the space race was to go into near-Earth orbit and to sit. Just sit, to see how long man could stay up there and how far out he could go until he couldn't come back. And the American-British research and development was to just go up and back, up and back. When you put them all together, you have a complete package without either side having to duplicate the other's work. That's why the Cold War was invented. To get that done. Now, they can sit out there. Even today, as you and I are having this conversation, there are Russians and an American. And her name is Sunita Williams. You know what her name is? Sunny. Sitting out there in the International Space Station right now, spinning around the Earth above our heads. Russians and Americans. This is exactly the same way that the UFO technology they have in their possession today was assembled. Need more proof? Even the Nazi scientists after the war were divided up and sent to continue their work for either the Russian Space Agency or the American and the British side, right? The head of the NSA at the very beginning was none other than Wernher von Braun. Hitler's highest-ranking rocket scientist, Dr. Karl Rosen, was the first woman corporate manager of Fairchild Industries and was the spokesperson for Wernher von Braun in the last years of his life. She even founded the Institute for Security and Cooperation in Outer Space in Washington, D.C., and has testified before their Congress on many occasions about space-based weapons. Von Braun revealed to Dr. Rosen a plan to justify weapons in space-based platforms on hoaxing an extraterrestrial threat. She went on to say, he said that the strategy that was being used to educate the public and decision makers was to use scare tactics. That was how we would eventually identify the enemy. The strategy that Wernher von Braun taught her was that first, the Russians were going to be considered to be the enemy, Cold War. In fact, in 1974, they were the enemy, the identified enemy. They were told that they had killer satellites. We were told that they were coming to get us and control us. And they were the commies. Then, she said, Wernher von Braun said, terrorists would be identified, and that was soon to follow. And I don't have to tell you about the war on terror. Then we were going to identify third world country crazies, which we now call the axis of evil. But he said it would be the third enemy against whom we would build space-based weapons. The next enemy, asteroids. Now at this point he kind of laughed the first time he said it. Asteroids. Against asteroids? We're going to build space-based weapons against asteroids? And the funniest thing of all was what he called aliens, extraterrestrials, she said. That would be the final scare. And over and over and over during the 4 years that she knew him, and giving speeches for him, he would bring up the last card, and he would say, "Remember, Karl, the last card is the alien card. We are going to have to build space-based weapons against aliens." And all of this is a lie. Werner von Braun on his deathbed. Space, back with more in a moment on A View from Space. This is AM 640 Toronto Radio.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio. Deprogramming the brainwashed simply by uncovering the truth. He's the Spaceman with A View from Space. AM 640 Toronto Radio.
I'm the Spaceman on AM 640 Toronto Radio. You can email me at space@640toronto.com or spaceman@640toronto.com. Thanks for the information that you've already emailed me in. There were two, count them, two major UFO sightings in 1947. 1948, the very next year, Israel became a country, setting the trap to draw all the world's armies into the Middle East for a conflict that will be called World War III. This is why George W. has not got any impetus whatsoever to leave Iraq, because that's where it's going to start. That's the jumping off point. Now, although these two sightings set the stage for modern UFOlogy, I'm talking about Paul and Evelyn Trent's sighting on May 11th of 1947. 1 month later, June 24th, 1947, just 1 month later, Kenneth Arnold's sighting is the second of these two tumultuous, gargantuan UFO sightings was witnessed. He sighted 9 objects flitting between the peaks of the Cascade Mountains while he was in his own aircraft. But these two, Kenneth Arnold's in June of 1947, and the Trent's sighting in May of 1947, just a month before, were not the first 20th century UFO encounters. In the closing stages of the Second World War, Allied pilots on nighttime bombing raids over Europe frequently reported strange flying objects. And these objects were christened, and some people will know it as a rock band, Foo Fighters, after a catchphrase in the popular Smokey Stover comic strip that was going around in those times. Where there's foo, there's fire. Foo was a play on the French word for fire. F-E-U, okay? That's how the French pronounce fire. Le feu. So, F-E-U was dropped and morphed into F-O-O. Foo Fighters. But that's what these objects were dubbed in the Second World War because of, as I said, the Smokey Stover comic strip. The aircrew suspected that the objects might be some kind of German secret weapon. On January 2nd, 1945, the New York Herald Tribune carried this short Associated Press release. It goes like this. Now it seems the Nazis have thrown something new into the night sky over Germany. It's the weird, mysterious Foo Fighter balls, which race alongside the wings of bullfighters flying intruder missions over Germany. Pilots have been encountering this eerie weapon for more than a month in their night flights. No one apparently knows what the sky weapon is. The balls of fire appear suddenly and accompany the planes for miles. They seem to be radio-controlled from the ground, so official intelligence reports reveal, in their book Man-Made UFOs, published in 1994 by Renato Vesco, a pioneer of the Nazi UFO connection, by the way, and David Hatcher Childress, cite the testimony of a former American pilot who worked for the intelligence section of the 8th Air Force towards the end of the war. The pilot wanted to identify these things, but wanted to keep his identity secret. So he told the New York Press in an anonymous letter, it's quite possible that the flying saucers are the latest development of a psychological anti-aircraft weapon that the Germans had already used during night missions over Germany. I happened to see on several occasions shining discs or balls that followed our formations. It was well known that the shining discs or balls were somehow intelligently controlled. German night fighters had powerful headlights in their noses or propeller hubs, but that wasn't what this was. So partly, in order to give the German pilots better aim, they had these lights in the fronts of their aircrafts, in the propeller hubs, and on the noses. And they caused quite a lot of alarm and a lot of nervous tension among the crews for the Allied bombing flights, which lowered their efficiency. When those lights shone in their faces, they couldn't sight any aircraft to shoot at it, the gunners on the bombers. During the last year of the war, the Germans also sent up a few radio-controlled bright objects to interfere with the ignition systems of the engines of the operations on the onboard radar also. In all probability, American scientists picked up on this invention and are now perfecting it so that it will be on par with the new offensive and defensive air weapons. Spaceman, AM 640, Toronto Radio, and A View from Space. The mystery of UFOs. The British UFO investigators, Peter Huff and Jenny Randis, made an interesting point that the Second World War saw more people in the sky than any other period in history, so it was no great surprise that unidentified flying objects would have been spotted all over the place. Of course, this statement implies that the possibility that the origin of some of these objects might have been non-human, from another planet. For them, the huge number of Foo Fighter sightings, coupled with the obvious interests that the objects showed in the Allied aircraft, strongly suggested that they were built specifically to interact in some way with the Allied bombers. But they never attacked. They just would come up alongside and follow, or be just above, or behind and follow. And as always, though, with the UFO mystery, genuine sightings started tons of rumors of official interest in the phenomenon. For instance, there was a secret British government investigation into the Foo Fighter reports called the Massey Project. But this was absolutely flat-out denied by the then Air Chief Marshal, Sir Victor Goddard, who was an outspoken believer in alien aircraft during the 1950s after the war. But, as I said, he flatly denied this contention that the Foo Fighters interested the British government. And he said that the Treasury approval for such a minor exercise at investigating this at a time when Britain was fighting for its survival would have been ludicrous. Nice cover-up, Sir Victor Goddard. And some encounters undoubtedly had logical explanations. I'll give you that. For example, during a bombing raid on a factory at Schweinfurt in Germany, on October 14th, 1943, flight crews of the American 384th Squadron saw what they said was a large cluster of discs, which were silver in color, 1 inch thick and about 3 inches in diameter. They were floating gently through the air, directly in the path of the American aircraft, and one pilot feared that his B-17 Flying Fortress would be destroyed on contact with these objects. But the bomber cut through the cluster of discs and continued on its way, untouched, undamaged. It's quite possible that the encounters like that were actually just pieces of metal tinfoil released by German Aphrodite balloons to confuse radar by returning false images, because the newly developed radar would just hit the tinfoil floating through the air and send up all kinds of erroneous signals. That would be an explanation. Nevertheless, a lot of air crews reported events that were not so easy to explain, including the harassment of their aircraft by small, glowing, disc-shaped and spherical objects that were highly maneuverable. On November 23, 1944, Lieutenant Edward Schluter of the 415th U.S. Night Fighter Squadron was flying a heavy night fighter from his base in Dijon in Burgundy in France, heading towards Mainz, Germany, 20 miles from Strasbourg. Lieutenant Ringwald, an Air Force intelligence officer who was on the mission as an observer, glanced out of the cockpit and noticed about 10 glowing red balls flying very fast in formation. Schluter suggested that they might be the stars, but his explanation was proved wrong when the objects actually approached the airplane. Schluter radioed the American ground radar station, informing them that they were being chased by German night fighters. The radar station replied there was nothing showing up on their scope. They were alone. Schluter's radar observer, Lieutenant Myers, checked his own scope, but detected nothing unusual either. Schluter then decided to make for the objects at full throttle. The response from the Foo Fighters was instantaneous. Their fiery red glow rapidly dimmed until they were lost in sight. Less than 2 minutes later, they reappeared, although they seemed to have lost interest in the American aircraft and glided off into the nights toward Germany. This is Spaceman, back with more on the mystery of the UFO in a moment on AM 640, Toronto Radio.
Extreme radio for extreme times. This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
I'm a Spaceman. It's AM 640, Toronto Radio. Thanks so much for the emails. John sends me a really great one. Even a picture of the Avro car, which I'll touch on. And it actually, if you live in Toronto, it's a bit of your history. John writes and sends me the photograph. This was a U.S.-sponsored program in the 50s. Apparently, they scrapped the program over a few years and took everything back to Nevada Area 51. Yes, that also figures into this Canadian connection with UFOs that's coming up on A View from Space on AM 640, Toronto Radio, tonight, on the mystery of the UFO, which to me is not a mystery at all. And they are not alien beings. They are us. I believe, and you would have to be. I would have to put the collar of naivety on you if you believed that we had what the elite rich have. that as soon as it's invented, it's given to all of us. No. You get the things they're done with when they have already moved on to something else that's greater. That's when you get it. That's when it's helping out mankind. First, it's got to help them. And the great work, remember, to stage the Antichrist and the one world government. The code word today is globalization. A single national economy is no longer the thing. They're going to prove that with the United States, believe me, and the American dollar. Globalization is where we're headed. Because we are not living in democracy. We are living in what you will call corporate fascism. Is it a free country? Hey, the corporation tells you when you can take your holiday. You don't take it when you want. So, back to the skies. World War II. As the objects appeared in the sky, these what are dubbed Foo Fighters, to the Allied bomber pilots, the fighters' radar always began to malfunction with these balls of fire around the aircraft, forcing the crew to abandon their mission many times. Sometimes their watches also would go haywire. So there was something of a higher technology going on that was even better, or that they were testing, that did not include killing, just on jamming radar. Because remember, radar had just come into play. It was a new trick to see you before you can actually be physically seen with the eyeball. The Germans were working on something that would overcome that, to counter it. So, in an encounter on November 27th, 1944, over Speyer, Germany, pilots Henry Giblin and Walter Cleary reported a large orange light flying at about 250 miles an hour, about 1,500 feet above the fighter. The radar station in the sector replied that there was nothing else there except them. Nevertheless, they also had a radar malfunction in their plane's radar system and forced it to return to base. An official report was made, the first of its kind, by the way, which resulted in a ton of jokes at the pilot's expense. After the November 27th encounter, pilots who saw Foo Fighters decided to just dummy up, not to tell anybody, and to not include them in their flight reports. This self-imposed censorship was broken by a couple of pilots named McFalls and Baker of the 415th, who submitted a flight report on their mission December 22, 1944. Here's part of that report. At 0600 hours near Hagenau, Germany, 10,000 feet altitude, two very bright lights climbed toward us from the ground. They leveled off and stayed on the tail of our plane. They were huge, bright, orange lights. They stayed there for 2 minutes, on my tail, all the time. They were under perfect control. When they turned away from us, the fire seemed to go out. The Foo Fighters were not only witnessed by air crews. Huff and Randy cite a report from a former prisoner of war at the Heidbrück camp in Upper Silesia, Poland. Huff and Randy's are a couple of UFO researchers. At 3 o'clock in Upper Silesia, Poland, On January 22nd, 1945, a few men were being paraded by the Germans before being marched away to evade the coming Russian army who were coming to free them. A bomber appeared overhead, flying at about 18,000 feet. The men gazed in horror at what seemed to be fire pouring out from its rear end. Then they thought it might be a flare caught up in the slipstream of the aircraft. Finally, they realized that this was neither. But the object was a silvery ball hugging the bomber, which was desperately trying to evade it, get away from it. The Foo Fighter was still right sticking on the tail of the aircraft as it passed into the distance. On January 1st, 1945, Howard Blakesley, science editor of the Associated Press, claimed that the mysterious Foo Fighters were nothing more than St. Elmo's fire. Spontaneous lights produced by an electrostatic discharge on the fuselage of the airplane. According to Blakesley, this explanation also accounted for the fact that the Foo Fighters didn't show up on radar. The pilots who actually encountered the objects were unimpressed with Blakesley's solution. Most of them had been flying for a bunch of years now and knew St. Elmo's fire when they saw it, and this was not St. Elmo's fire. The Foo Fighters were something entirely different. The light they produced went on and off at intervals that seemed to relate to their speed. The shape, most of the time, was clearly discernible as either a disk or a sphere, a ball. You know what keeps hitting me? The 50s song, Jerry Lee Lewis. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. Anyway, they were frequently reported as spinning rapidly on their vertical axis. No Allied aircraft were ever brought down by a Foo Fighter, which seemed considered likely that the objects were dangerous German secret weapons, maybe a radical development of a V-weapon technology. V-weapon technology, you know it as rocket science. The first pilotless rockets were made by the Nazis. They were called V-1 rockets. Then they come up with the V-2s. In England, they called those V-2s the doodlebugs. They were designed to run out of fuel over England and fall from the sky. They had explosives aboard and blew up when they hit the earth. It was only a psychological weapon used by the Nazis. Same thing as the IEDs that they're using now in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're not to kill a lot of people. It's a psychological weapon. The V-1s were already causing panic and some carnage in London. And it was known that German scientists were desperately trying to develop a ballistic missile that could hit America. As a matter of fact, a few Foo Fighter stories were even leaked in December of 1944 to the American Legion magazine, which published the personal opinions of several U.S. intelligence officers that the Foo Fighters were radio-controlled, radar-jamming devices sent up by the Germans. There's a story even of an unnamed B-17 pilot who decided to intercept the Foo Fighter and succeeded in getting within a few hundred yards of this shining sphere. He said he heard a strange sound. He said it sounded like the backwash of invisible airplanes. The last reported encounter with Foo Fighters happened in early May of 1945 near the eastern edge of the Vosveld. A pilot from the 415th Squadron saw 5 orange balls of light flying in a V formation in the distance. Spaceman, AM 640, Toronto Radio, with the mystery of UFOs. More coming up, as well as abductions. I will try and cover the abductee angle of the UFOs on this show. More in a minute.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio. You're listening to A View from Space with the Spaceman, exercising the right to free speech while he still can. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
Spaceman, AM 640, Toronto Radio, with a mystery of the UFO revealed tonight. Revealing at least the view from space on UFOs. I mean, there are people that are just so absolutely and totally brainwashed with the television shows, going all the way back to what? I don't know what the first one was. Maybe My Favorite Martian. I don't know. But it was in all of the cartoons, extraterrestrials, people from outer space being put into the mix, and so many movies. It's almost unbelievable that people can't see that it was a very determined and a very directed act to put this in front of us at a certain time in history. And it began as the Second World War was ending and the 50s started to roll in. The two biggest sightings of UFOs that go down in history as the two that kicked it off were the Trent sighting, 1947, May 11th, and the June 24th sighting of Kenneth Arnold. In the 2 years between the end of the Second World and the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which was, as I've just mentioned, June 24th, 1947, strange unidentified aerial objects invaded the skies over Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark even, and they were later reported as far away as Morocco and India. They were doing it all over the world. Nicknamed ghost rockets because of their long, thin profile, cigar shape, and occasional fiery exhaust. These objects were reported to perform astonishing maneuvers, like diving and climbing rapidly at enormous speeds, doing astonishing maneuvers. The British UFO investigator Timothy Good cites the confidential Department of State telegram from the American Embassy in Stockholm dated 11th July 1946. It states, for some weeks there have been numerous reports of strange rocket-like missiles being seen in Swedish and Finnish skies. During the past few days, reports of such objects being seen have greatly increased. Member of legation saw one Tuesday afternoon. One landed on a beach near Stockholm same afternoon without causing any damage, and according to press, fragments are now being studied by the military authorities. A local scientist on the first inspection stated it contained an organic substance resembling carbide. Defense staff last night issued a communique listing various places where missiles had been observed and urging the public to report all mysterious sound and light phenomena. They were propagating the myth of alien spacecraft. It was an attack on the Nordic country census. The report goes on. Press this afternoon announces just one such missile fell in Stockholm suburb at 2:30 in the afternoon. The missile, observed by a member of the legation, made no sound and seemed to be falling rapidly to Earth when it was spotted. No sound of explosion followed either. Military attachés investigating through Swedish channels had been promised results, Swedish observations, but Swedes profess ignorance as to the origin, character, or purpose of missiles, but state definitely they are not launched by Swedes. Eyewitness reports state missiles came in from a southerly direction proceeding at northwest. 6 units, Atlantic Fleet, under Admiral Hewitt, arrived at Stockholm this morning. If missiles are of Soviet origin, as generally believed, some reports say they are launched from Estonia, the purpose might be political. to intimidate Swedes in connection with the Soviet pressure on Sweden being built up in connection with current loan negotiations, or to offset supposed increase in the military pressure on Sweden resulting from the naval visit and recent bikini tests. That was the Bikini Islands. They were testing the atomic bombs right at this time. It's almost as if there was an entire satanic attack with the bomb being perfected. The tests, the bikini tests, and these strange sightings of this phenomena called UFOs. It all seems to be about the same time. Aaron writes me at AM 640, Spaceman at 640toronto.com, and says, Parsons, Jack Parsons, the laboratory in Pasadena, now called the Jet Propulsion Lab, JPL. It actually stands for Jack Parsons Laboratory. He sends me information that Jack, and I knew Jack was heavily into the occult and loved Aleister Crowley, but before each test launch in the Pasadena Jet Propulsion Lab, he was in the habit of invoking Aleister Crowley's hymn to Pan, the wild, horned god of fertility. Parsons, by the way, was an active member in the California Agape Lodge of the sex magical group Ordo Templi Orientis, the cult of Aleister Crowley. He says in 1947 is a huge year, which ended the first stage of the Babylon working as Parsons and Hubbard parted ways. That's the founder of Scientology. Parted ways with Jack Parsons of the Jet Propulsion Lab amid a cloud of turmoil. 1947 was the year that Dead Scrolls were discovered. In the very same year, 1948, Israel became a nation. Just months later, the transistor was invented. The sound barrier was broken. And the modern age of UFOs flew into view with the Kenneth Arnold sightings that I told you about on June 24th, 1947. It was also the year Aleister Crowley died. And he also mentions that LSD, allegedly discovered in 1948, threw even more fuel on this roaring fire, which indicates that strange things were indeed happening in the human consciousness in the years between 1946 and 1948. So the suspicion voiced in this telegram that I've been telling you about with the Swedes, thinking that the Soviets might be responsible for the ghost rocket sightings, was natural enough, given the fact that the Cold War was then just getting underway too. Both the Americans and Russians, of course, captured German weapons technology at the end of the war, and it was assumed that by many in authority that the Russians were experimenting with the V-1 and V-2 rocket designs. Actually, a German V-2 rocket had already crashed in Sweden in the summer of 1944. The fact that both the United States and the Soviet Union carried out a lot of high important experiments with captured Nazi technology will even be more significant as you and I look at claims that the Nazis are behind the UFO connections. A few British scientists were sent to Sweden to examine the ghost rocket reports. One of them was Professor Jones, the then director of the intelligence of Britain's air staff and scientific advisor to Section 4 of MI6. That's the Secret Service of Britain that houses James Bond. MI6 looks after the British interests abroad. In this book called The Most Secret War, his account of his involvement with the British scientific intelligence between 39 and 49, the years 1939 and 49, Professor Jones wrote about the fears that the rockets were Russian. The general interpretation was that the ghost rockets were long-range flying bombs being flown by the Russians over Sweden as an act of intimidation. This interpretation was accepted by the officers in their own air technical intelligence, who worked out the performance of the bombs from the reported sightings in one of the instances, where the object appeared to have dashed about at random over the whole of southern Sweden at speeds up to 2,000 miles an hour. What the officers concerned failed to notice was that every observer, wherever he was, reported the object as well was always to the east. By far the most likely explanation that it was a meteor, maybe as far east as even Finland, and the fantastic speeds that were reported were merely due to the fact that all observers had seen it more or less simultaneously, right together. But they had different times on their watches. Their watches failed them at the point of observation, so that any attempt to draw a track by linking up observations in a time sequence couldn't have been done. Professor Jones considered it extremely unlikely that the ghost rockets over Sweden would be Russian missiles based on German V-2 designs. He said that the rockets seen over Scandinavia had more than twice the range of the V-2. An increase in performance that was so great given the short time of capture of the German designs. Spaceman back with more in a moment on the mystery of UFOs revealed on AM 640 Toronto Radio. You can email me at space@640toronto.com or spaceman@640toronto.com if you have a comment.
Extreme radio for extreme times. This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
Spaceman, AM 640, Toronto Radio. I just got caught up reading these emails. Absolutely unbelievable. Star Trek, back in the 60s, was so far advanced, one had to wonder if Japan had warehouses of gadgets years ahead of time to be brought out slowly for maximum dollar effect. Next paragraph from Terry here as he writes, one thing that bothers me is of all the repeats of every sci-fi movie, why is the series V never to return for a second time? What's hidden in this flick? So I did a little quick check on the plot summary of the science fiction two-part miniseries television, followed in '84 by a three-part miniseries, The Final Battle. The plot goes like this. The story is set in the near future. Aliens who appear human arrive on Earth in a fleet of 50 huge saucer-like motherships which park over key major cities. They appear to be friendly, seeking the help of humans to obtain chemicals needed to aid their ailing world. In return, the visitors promise to share their advanced technology with humanity. The governments of Earth accept, and the visitors gain considerable influence with authorities. However, strange things are soon noted. Scientists find themselves facing increasing media hostility and government restrictions on their activities and movements. Others, particularly those keen on examining the visitors more closely, begin to disappear or face discredit. Noted scientists confess to subversive activities, some exhibiting other unusual behavior, such as suddenly demonstrating an opposite hand preference to the one they are known to have. Journalist and television cameraman Michael Donovan sneaks aboard one of the visitors' motherships and discovers that beneath their human-like facade, the aliens are reptilian in nature and carnivorous, preferring to eat live food like rodents and birds. He learns from a visitor named Martin that the story about the needed chemicals is merely a diversion. The true purpose of the visitor's trip to Earth is to conquer and subdue the planet, steal all the water, and harvest the human race's food, leaving only a few as slaves and cannon fodder, soldiers, for the visitors' wars with other alien races. How close to the truth can you get? Donovan, the cameraman and journalist who snuck aboard one of the motherships, also discovers there are dissidents among the visitors, known as the Fifth Column, who oppose the leader's plans. Just like in the real world, well, there's French Freemasonry and British Freemasonry fighting one another to put their own leader on the stage as the Antichrist to rule the world. Unbelievable. Isn't that incredible? No wonder they've not rerun V, the miniseries. So many things fit together because, I believe that all of us together, if we throw everything together that we know, we have their whole plan. The problem is coming together as a force. So the Illuminati-controlled view of history is that while the Germans possess some remarkable and deadly weapons, like the V-1 and the V-2 and the jet-engined Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter, their technological innovations didn't go much further than that. But after all of this mystery of the Foo Fighters I've been telling you about, and the ghost rockets and UFOs, which many professional scientists even now admit reluctantly and anonymously, seems to be worthy of a second look, because you really have to look at the claims of some of the UFO researchers and the incredible devices seen so often flitting through the skies are actually machines based on Nazi designs for ultra-high-performance disc-shaped craft capable of traveling not only through our atmosphere, but also into near outer space. Renato Vesco is a pioneer of the Nazi UFO theory connection. He believes what I do. A graduate of the University of Rome, studied aeronautical engineering at the German Institute for Aerial Development, and during the war was sent to work at Fiat's underground installation at Lake Garda in northern Italy. In the 60s, Vesco investigated UFO sightings for the Italian Air Ministry. In 1971, he published the theory of man-made flying saucers, entitled Intercetta Senza Sparare, roughly translated meaning intercept without firing. The book talks in detail about the possible technology behind the UFOs and reaches the astonishing and highly controversial conclusion that UFO technology is well within the capabilities of the human science, and was even back then, during the Second World War, also capable. Vesco is pretty certain that the origin of the UFOs, still seen today by witnesses all over the world, can be placed firmly in Nazi Germany in the early 1940s. Also, technology principles behind these craft were, he believes, divided between the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the war, with both superpowers going to develop and refine the designs of their own. According to Vesco, the Luftwaffe scientists Oberammergau of Bavaria did research into an electrical device capable of interfering with an aircraft engine up to a distance of about 100 feet. Through the generation of intense electromagnetic fields, this device could short-circuit the target aircraft's ignition system and cause total loss of power. This short range, though, was considered impracticable for a successful weapon, so they attempted to increase its distance to 300 feet instead of 100. These plans were still only on the drawing board by the end of the war, so the weapon was never put into production. Nevertheless, these researchers did the groundwork that was put to use by Albert Speer and his like at the SS Technical General Staff. They produced a device capable of proximity radio interference on the delicate radar systems of American bomber pilots. They came up with a highly original flying machine. It was circular, armored, more or less resembling the shell of a turtle, was powered by a special turbojet engine, also flat and circular, whose principles were a lot like the well-known AOL of Hero, a rocket-like device that used steam for propulsion, which generated a great halo of luminous flames at the back. That's where it's got its name, the Fireball. It was unarmed and pilotless. Radio controlled at the moment of takeoff. It would then automatically follow enemy aircraft attracted by their exhaust flames and approach close enough without collision to wreck their radar gear. The fiery halo around the craft's perimeter was generated by a combination of the rich fuel mixture and the chemical additives causing ionization of the atmosphere around the Fireball. So, as it approached the target aircraft, this ionization would produce powerful electrostatic and electromagnetic fields that would interfere with the radar. Sounds to me like they got the heat-seeking missile out of this. The electromagnetic pulse weapon system that they blew the Columbia shuttle apart with. A lot of technology came out of this. A lot of that technology was just being started, just being researched. The groundwork was being laid. And now, because we have 20/20 hindsight, we can see the weaponry systems that came through their ideas and are now come to fruition. That guy with the V, why they don't put it out again, replay it? There's a V remake this fall. So, A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio's listeners are keeping you right on the cutting edge of where the Illuminati is headed. Coming back with more in just a moment.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio. Deprogramming the brainwashed simply by uncovering the truth. He's the Spaceman with A View from Space. AM 640 Toronto Radio.
We got a call Space. It's AM 640 Toronto Radio. I want to welcome you if you're driving around town listening to AM 640 Toronto Radio in your car, if you're at work listening, or if you're dialed into Star Choice on Channel 865 listening, or if you're in front of your Mac or your PC, logged on to 640toronto.com, picking up the live audio streaming wherever you are in the world. I welcome you in. We're talking about the mystery of the UFO and demystifying it, and connecting it with some of the experiments and some of the research and development that was going on in the later years of the Nazi operation in Germany where they were on the cutting edge of jet engines, almost had an atom bomb. There were many things. And then after the war in 1947, two huge events. The sighting of the very first and most believable sighting of a UFO by a couple of farmers, a man and his wife in Oregon, who took a couple of snapshots. And, of course, it went right around the world after Life magazine picked up on it. And was not deemed to be a hoax. And I don't believe it was a hoax either. I believe it was the real thing, but I don't believe that they were extraterrestrials flying it. I believe they were men. And other things that are close to men that I will touch on before the show close tonight here on A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio. And the second event in 1947 was just 1 month later, when Kenneth Arnold was flying his own aircraft and saw 9 UFOs through the Cascade Mountains, zigzagging and flitting through the sky. And then these fireballs that I've been describing that some of the Allied pilots, bombing pilots in the Second World War, near the close of the Second World War, saw in the night sky over Germany. They were incredible objects in the sky for these pilots, and they were very afraid to put them on their flight reports after the flight, because a lot of them were taking a lot of they were the brunt of jokes that they were seeing unidentified flying objects. And I was stating earlier, if you were born and lived before 1950, no one, absolutely no one in their right mind believed that there were UFOs, that they existed. I mean, you were an idiot if you thought that. But after 1950 and on, it was exactly the opposite. You were an idiot if you didn't believe, or even naive to think that we were alone in the universe, because of such an incredible, intense brainwashing that we were subjected to through stories, books, these sightings that I've been talking about, and through television shows and movies, of course, showing that man could travel through the stars. And a lot of people still believe that NASA's black magic spell that they're casting is actually true, that we're actually going to Jupiter and places like Saturn. That is absurd. If they can't stop spam on your computer, you cannot put a machine on a moon that's orbiting Jupiter. Sorry, not buying it. They're black magic. That's what they are, black magic. Albert Einstein himself will tell you mathematics is a lie. You can make numbers say anything you want. Check out what's going on in the stock market. They're just numbers, but they got people doing certain things because that number is a certain number. It's absolutely unbelievable, the power of numbers. So as these fireballs approached the Allied pilots in the Second World War, the halo produced by the engine gave the impression of enormous size. They had the effect of unnerving these pilots even more. And as the fireball approached, the pilots didn't fire on them for fear of being caught in a gigantic explosion. In fact, the devices did carry an explosive charge that would destroy them in an event of a capture, in addition to an ingenious feature that would ensure a quick escape in the event of an attack by an Allied aircraft. Underneath this fireball was its armored outer shell. Each fireball contained a thin sheet of electrically insulated aluminum. Should a bullet pierce the armor, contact would be made between it and the aluminum sheet and would close a circuit, activating a vertical maximum acceleration device and taking the craft out of weapons range in just a matter of seconds like that. The fireball was constructed at the Henschel Rax Aeronautical Assembly Plant in Wiener Neustadt, Germany, according to a witness who saw them being test-flown even in daylight. The craft looked like shining discs spinning on their vertical axis, and at night like huge burning globes. Hermann Göring inspected the progress of the Fireball project a lot of times, hoping the mechanical principles could be applied to an even bigger offensive saucer-shaped aircraft. He got his wish, because the Kugelblitz, meaning ball lightning automatic fighter, the second authentic prototype after the Fireball to the present day flying saucers, and the first example of the jet lift aircraft, otherwise known as the British Harrier jet. That's where that technology is now. In 1952, a former Luftwaffe engineer named Rudolf Schreiber gave a series of interviews to the West German press and claimed to have designed an aircraft strikingly similar to the Kugelblitz. Schreiber was an engineer and a test pilot for the Heinkel factory in Eiger. In 1941, he began to toy with the idea of an aircraft that could take off vertically, which eliminated the need for runways, of course, which were always vulnerable to enemy bombing. So even in war-torn areas, you could actually land a jet. That's what the Harrier's job is, to get into places where just a helicopter could, but a helicopter doesn't have the firepower like a Harrier would. By June the following year, he built and flew a working model of this design, obviously the forerunner to the Harrier, the British Harrier, and began on a full-sized 15-foot version. In mid-1944, Schreiber was transferred to the BMW plant near Prague, Czechoslovakia, where he was joined by an engineer from the rocket site at Peenemünde named Walter Minth. Another engineer named Klaus Habermohl joined them, and an Italian physicist from the aeronautical complex at Riva del Garda, Dr. Giuseppe Belluzzo, joined them. Together, they built an even larger piloted version of the disc, featuring a domed pilot's cabin sitting at the center of a circular set of multiple wings driven by a turbine engine mounted on the disc's vertical axis. The German disc program went under the title Project Saucer, which was W.A. Harbinson also looked at as the title for his excellent 5-novel series inspired by the Nazi UFO connection theory. According to the military historian Major Rudolf Lusar, Schreiber's disc was a wide-surface ring which rotated around a fixed cupola-shaped cockpit. A cupola is just a dome. The ring contained adjustable wing discs, which could be brought into the right position for the takeoff of straight-up or horizontal flight. The Model 3 flying disc had a diameter of 138 feet and a height of 105 feet. It was large. According to Schreiber, the finished disc was ready for testing and flying early in 1944, but it was destroyed, supposedly, by its builders to prevent it from falling into the hands of the advancing Allied armies. Yeah, right. The Illuminati controlled both sides of World War II. They had inside people on each side. The Red Cross was actually the one that could go into no man's land and be the messengers. So whatever the Germans were undertaking, and whatever the Americans and British were undertaking, and the Russians, the ones that ran it all, knew all. And so all of the research and development belonged to them, and they, of course, collected it. Renato Vesco states that a highly advanced supersonic disc-shaped aircraft called the Kugelblitz was indeed test-flown near Nordhausen, an underground rocket complex, in February of 1944. Also known as the V-7, this machine was said to have climbed a height of 37,600 feet in just 3 minutes and reached a speed of over 1,000 nautical miles per hour. This craft and the technicians who built it were apparently seized by the Russians and taken to Siberia, where the disc project continued under Soviet control, while Vesco concedes the hard evidence for a German flying disc program is very hard to actually track down and give proof of. He does say that the senior official of a 1945 British technical mission revealed that he had discovered German plans for an entirely new and deadly development in air warfare. These plans must have obviously gone beyond normal jet aircraft designs, because both sides already had jet-powered aircraft in production and operational by the end of the war. More to come on AM 640 with the mystery revealed of UFOs on A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio.
History buffs, monarchists masticate, truth seekers cheer. He's the Spaceman with A View from Space. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
Spaceman, AM 640, Toronto Radio, with the mystery of the UFO revealed tonight on A View from Space. I was just talking about the Kugelblitz, which was a machine, a V-7 machine that could climb to a height of 37,000 plus in just 3 minutes and reach speeds of over 1,200 miles an hour. Apparently seized by the Russians, taken to Siberia after the war, and continued. So who knows what they have today. Absolutely mind-blowing. Because these plans that they had way back in the 40s and 50s had already gone way beyond normal jet aircraft designs. Because obviously in the Korean War in the 50s, both sides, the Russians and Americans, had jet power. The Americans flew the Sabre. And Schreiber, who was an eyewitness, who died some 15 years after the war, was convinced that the large numbers of post-war UFO sightings were evidence that his designs had been built and developed. On May 2nd of 1980, another man claimed to be of the German press, also said that he worked on the Project Saucer. Heinrich Fleibner, then 76 years old, told Neue Press magazine that he was a technical consultant on a jet-propelled disc-shaped aircraft that had been built at Piemont from parts manufactured in other locations. Fleibner also claimed that Göring had been the overseer to the project and planned to use the disc as a courier plane, but that the Wehrmacht had supposedly destroyed most of the plans in the face of the Allied advance. These plans, of course, went into the hands of the Illuminati, who control both sides, had connections deep within the leadership of both sides. According to Harbinson, the notes and drawings for Fleibner's flying saucer, first registered in West Germany on March 27, 1954, were assigned to Transoceanic Los Angeles, California. on March 28th the following year and registered with the United States Patent Office on June 7th, 1960. According to Vesco, the Austrian inventor Victor Schauberger, after being kidnapped by the Nazis, designed a few disc-shaped aircraft for the Third Reich, beginning 1938 to 1945. These saucers were powered by what Schauberger called liquid vortex propulsion. If water or air is rotated into a twisting form of oscillation, known as colloidal, he said a buildup of energy results which, with immense power, can actually cause levitation, can actually cause the machine to lift, almost looking as if it defies gravity. Whether this bizarre form of propulsion is workable, I don't know. But once again, the Americans seem to have taken many of Schauberger's documents at the end of the war, with the Russians taking what was left and blowing up his apartment when they finished. Schauberger supposedly went to America in the 50s to work on a top-secret project in Texas for the United States government, although this unspecified project was apparently not particularly successful, so they say. Schauberger died in 1958, reportedly saying on his deathbed, "They took everything from me, everything. I don't even own myself." There's no doubt that radical aeroform designs were being tested in and around this time. For example, the Messerschmitt 163A, powered by a liquid fuel Walter rocket, and was given its first powered flight in August 1941. It was clocked at speeds of over 600 miles an hour, nearly twice as fast as the average speed of a fighter aircraft at that time. A second version, the ME 163B, was built with a more powerful motor. The design was not perfected, but until mid-1944, when approximately 370 of them were built and deployed throughout Germany in a last-ditch attempt to defeat the British and their allies. The Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force air crews who encountered them commented in their reports on how fast and dangerous these craft were. On a lot of occasions, the ME-163s were so fast that the Allied air gunners had no chance to deal with them. But the ME-163 could only stay in a combat situation for about 25 minutes. After that, it had no power left, and the relatively small number prevented them from having much success against the Allied advance. A question of too little too late, or was it a question of holding back the Germans to get the idea and then end it and take the ideas? If the Germans did succeed in producing a piloted flying disc, what happened to it? Spaceman, AM 640, Toronto Radio. Dr. Hans Kammler, the SS Obergruppenführer, who towards the end of the war had access to all areas of secret air armament projects, has the answer. Kammler worked on the V-2 rocket project along with Werner von Braun, who, as I've said, would later head NASA's Apollo Moon program, and Luftwaffe Major General Walter Dornberger, who would later become vice president of the Bell Aircraft Company in the United States. And Heinrich Himmler planned to separate the SS from the Nazi Party and state control through the establishment of a group of business and industrial fronts, making it independent of the state budget. Hitler approved that proposal in early of 1944. And you know what? That's exactly how the CIA was set up in America. It was taken right out of the German Hitler SS playbook. By the end of the war, Dr. Hans Kammler decided to use V-2 rocket technology and scientists as bargaining chips with the British Americans and the Russians. The war was ending. Things got a little crazy. Dr. Hans Kammler somehow, some way, made a deal. I'm back with that next on AM 640, Toronto Radio. This is A View from Space. I'm Space.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio. Extreme radio for extreme times. This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640 Toronto Radio.
I'm the Spaceman. You can email me at space@640toronto.com or spaceman@640toronto.com. I have to say the emails that I have been getting are very knowledgeable and absolutely mind-blowing. Tonight's show, UFOs, I have never, ever had on as a show topic. Mentioned it occasionally, and when I did mention, it was always men are behind this, not extraterrestrials, because I believe that we are absolutely alone in the universe or universes. I believe it's a concerted effort by the elite rich, the Illuminati, to trick us into believing that there is a super race, someone that is far greater than we. And of course, we already know their motivation, world domination. So I've been talking about Dr. Hans Kammler, the SS Obergruppenführer, who, towards the end of that Second World War, had access to all areas of secret air armament projects for Hitler. Worked with Werner von Braun. Worked with Walter Dornberger, the Vice President of Bell Aircraft, United States. And nearing the end of the war, Dr. Hans Kammler decided to use the V-2 rocket technology and scientists as bargaining chips to gain his freedom. So on April 2nd, 1945, 500 technicians and engineers were placed on a train along with 100 SS troops and technicians and engineers, and were sent to a secret alpine location in where? Bavaria. Where else? If you've listened to A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio, you will know that Bavaria is the home of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, better known as the Windsors, in Buckingham Palace. Also, Bavaria is the home of Joseph Ratzinger, or now known as Pope Benedict XVI. So, a couple of days later, on April 4th, 1945, von Braun requested permission from Kammler to resume project research, to which Kammler replied that he was about to disappear for an indefinite length of time. This was the last last time anybody ever saw Hans Kammler. He disappeared. This guy was an incredibly had an incredibly large advantage when it came to negotiating for his life with the Allies. Kammler's disappearance is, of course, very bizarre, until you consider the possibility that he possessed plans for a technology even more advanced than the V-2. Did the Third Reich, or an extension of it, have the capability to produce a UFO, or the clout to deal from a position of strength with one of the Allied nations? Well, my answer would be a loud Yes. It is assumed that Dr. Hans Kammler committed suicide when he was about to be apprehended by the Czech resistance in Prague, but there's no definite proof of this. So, what really happened to Hans Kammler? How about he, along with many other high-ranking Nazis, survived the end of the war and escaped to an unlikely location? Hard to believe? I don't think so. If you have something the Illuminati needs or desires, it doesn't matter what you did or who you are. Just before I get into Canada's connection with a flying saucer and that phenomenon, let me just take a quick call. Hello, sir.
Yeah, it's Tom here.
AM 640, Toronto Radio. I'm the Spaceman. Please tell me, Tom, what you do for a living.
I'm in advertising distribution.
All right. And you bill yourself as a UFO investigator, is that correct?
That's correct.
At what capacity? For magazine, television?
Well, I did publish a magazine at one time.
So you have a vested interest in this, or is it just something that you do as a hobby?
That's a hobby.
Okay. And you say that you have actually, and this is the reason why I took your call, that you have actually interviewed one of the pilots that have flown one of these saucers.
No. You remember a gentleman that was deported to Germany, Ernest Zundel?
Oh, sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I bought a book back in the 70s, published by Zundel, called UFO, the Nazi Secret Weapon.
I know about it and he just jumped on the UFO wagon to press his other his other agenda. But go ahead, continue.
So I contacted Zundel when he lived down on College Street, I think it was. This is going back to the mid-70s.
Sure.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And he led me on to a gentleman in Burlington who owned a repair shop, like for Porsches and Volkswagens and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
He's a German gentleman. And he was, I would say, in his early 60s when I met him. Okay.
So that would place him maybe late teens in the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War.
Could have been. It was 1942. This event took place over Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave me the address, and I phoned the fellow up, and he told me to come down and talk to him. And it enlightened me, I'll tell you, because this gentleman was very sincere, and he was a Luftwaffe test pilot. And he was flying one of the planes over Berlin in June of 1942 when this saucer-shaped object came into view and totally disrupted his guidance systems on his plane. And
exactly what I've been explaining.
Same as Bermuda Triangle events, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And he said that this craft had the technology to go from 0 to 5,000 miles per hour in less than 15 seconds. But they couldn't put a pilot in it because of the G-forces. This astounded me when I was talking to this gentleman. He was very sincere. Now, this was June 1942. They had this craft flying over Germany.
Mm-hmm. These are the fireballs that I was talking about, and the pilots, the Allied pilots, would call these the Foo Fighters.
No, this was an actual saucer-shaped craft. This was not a light.
But this is
daytime. This happened. This is daytime. It happened.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he identified the craft in his area he was flying. It came right close to him and totally disrupted his guidance systems on his plane.
Well, that's exactly what I was talking about. See, some of the fireballs are round, and some of them were saucer shaped. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the exact same machine that I have been alluding to here on the show. Now, why would Ernst Zundel put you onto this gentleman? Did you inquire about him?
Well, no, I told him. He knew I was a UFO investigator.
Oh, okay, I get the picture. All right.
And when I contacted him, he said, "Do you want to do me a favor and interview this guy?" And I thought, well, gee, this is a real chance for a good scoop. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I went out to Burlington to Brand Street, and he had a repair shop just south of the QEW on Brand Street in Burlington. And I had a long chat with this guy.
And he convinced you?
Absolutely.
Well, because I'm absolutely and totally convinced that those Foo Fighters that the Allied bomber pilots saw were real. Tom, I thank you so much for the confirmation call.
No problem.
Thank you, sir. Now, I just want to take you from Burlington now. I want to take you to Malton for the Canadian connection on this. The opinion of Illuminati-controlled history is that while many highly advanced weapon designs were on the drawing board, with some actually being put into limited production in the final months of the war, nothing with the design or performance characteristics of flying saucers, though, was ever built in Nazi Germany. And yet, in 1953, only 8 years after the end of the war, right here in Toronto, the Toronto Star announced that a flying saucer was being developed by the A.V. Roe Company. That's A.V.R.O.E., the A.V. Roe Company, now known as the Avro Canada Company. Its facilities were in Malton, just out by the airport. According to the report, apparently leaked by a well-informed source within the company, the machine would have a top speed of over 1,500 miles an hour. This understandably provoked a sudden and intense interest in the subject from a lot of members of the press who asked for clarification from the Canadian government. A statement was released saying this: the defense authorities are examining all ideas, even revolutionary ones, that have been suggested for the development of new types of supersonic aircraft, also including flying discs. This, however, is still in the beginning phase of research and will be a number of months before we are able to reach anything positive, and 7 more years before we come to actual production. Now, on February 16th, 1953, C.D. Howe, the Minister of Defense Production, told the Canadian House of Commons that the government was studying new fighter aircraft concepts, adding weight to reports that the Avro is even now being worked on in a mock-up model of a flying saucer capable of flying over 1,500 miles an hour and climbing straight up in the air. Less than a couple of weeks later, February of 1953, the Avro president, Crawford Gordon Jr., wrote in the company's journal, "One of our projects can be said to be quite revolutionary in concept and appearance. The prototype being built is so revolutionary that when it flies, all other types of supersonic aircraft will become obsolete." This is all that Avro Canada are going to say about this project. This statement was followed by 2 months of silence, then another revelation in the Toronto Star. April 21st, 1953, Field Marshal Montgomery, Old Monty, became one of a handful of people ever to see Avro's mock-up of a flying saucer, reputedly capable of 1,500 miles an hour. The guide who accompanied Monty quoted him as describing it as fantastic. Security precautions surrounding the super secret were so tight that 2 of Montgomery's escorts from Scotland Yard were barred from the screened-off area at the Avro plant. On April 21st, the Toronto Star added that the flying disc was constructed of metal, wood, and plastics, and referred to it as a gyroscopic fighter with a revolving gas turbine engine. Little more was written in the Canadian press until November 1st, 1953, when a report, brief one too, appeared stating a mock-up of the Canadian flying saucer, the highly secretive aircraft whose existence few believe, was yesterday shown to a group of 25 American experts, including military officers and scientists. This $200 million prototype was also known as the Avro Omega. This is the picture John sent me earlier in the show, when I stated that I'd hope I could get to the Canadian connection with the flying saucer, and here we are. Now, the Avro Omega was named probably because of its not because of its shape, but it was more like the Greek letter than a perfect circle. The press claimed the Canadian government planned to deploy squadrons of these flying saucers for the defense of the far north of the country. Their VTOL, their vertical takeoff and landing capabilities, making them ideal for forested or snow-covered terrain. Once again, it was followed by a period of official and press silence on the matter, broken only by the revelation that the project's principal designer was the aeronautical engineer John Frost, and persistent rumors that the United States military had become involved. I pick up the story on the other side of the hour. Spaceman, AM 640, Toronto Radio. Back with more in a moment.
History buffs, monarchists masticate, truth seekers cheer. He's the Spaceman with a view from space. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
It's the Spaceman on AM 640, Toronto Radio. Talking about the Canadian connection with the flying saucer Nazi connection. Right here in Malton at the AV Row. Now, this was later changed to the Avro Canada Company. John Frost, persistent rumors said that the United States military had become involved. John Frost, the head aeronautical engineer at AV Row, a Brit, was the head of this entire project. He said this ship will be able to take off vertically, to hover in midair, and to move at a speed of about 1,850 nautical miles per hour. That is, it would be capable of performing all of the maneuvers that flying discs are said to be capable of. And, of course, as I said, this astonishing craft, the brainchild of the English aeronautical engineer John C.M. Frost, who worked, by the way, for the Havilland factory in England during the war, and who later went on to AV Row in Malton, Canada, to set up the building of this aircraft there. John Frost is your connection from Britain, who would have brought over the Nazi designs here to Canada in Malton. And this aircraft was supposedly going to be built for the United States Air Force. And it wouldn't have been the first time that Frost had designed an aircraft for the United States Air Force. A couple of years before this, he had designed and submitted to American experts an aircraft that would be called the Flying Manta because of its behavior on takeoff. It more or less resembled the disc of today, but it could not take off vertically. And its top speed couldn't exceed any more than 1,430 nautical miles per hour. The Manta had interested the American General Staff, but because of the operating deficiencies, it was decided that they wouldn't be building it. These high hopes for the U.S. Canadian flying discs were dashed when, on December 3rd, 1954, the Canadian Defense Ministry suddenly announced that the project was to be abandoned on the grounds that the technology required to make it work was too expensive and speculative. Nearly a year later, though, on October of 1955, the United States Air Force Secretary Donald Quarles made an intriguing statement through the Department of Defense press office saying, "We are now entering a period of aviation technology in which aircraft of unusual configuration and flight characteristics will begin to appear. The Air Force will fly the first jet-powered vertical rising airplane in a matter of days. We have another project under contract with Avro Limited of Canada, which could result in disc-shaped aircraft somewhat similar to the popular concept flying saucer. While some of these may take novel forms, such as the Avro project, they are direct line descendants of conventional aircraft and should not be regarded as supernatural or mysterious." vertical rising aircraft capable of transition to supersonic or horizontal flight will be a new phenomenon in our skies, he said, and under certain conditions could give the illusion of the so-called flying saucer. This is in 1955. And he went on to say, I think we must recognize that all other countries also have the capability of developing vertical rising aircraft, perhaps of unconventional shapes. However, we are satisfied at this time that none of the sightings of the so-called flying saucers reported in this country were in fact aircraft of foreign origin. Is he admitting that some of the aircraft that have been spotted as UFOs were actually their test flights? Even if you forget Quarles' surprising statement, the Avro company was in fact going through strange times following the cancellation by the Canadian government of the contract of the CF-105 Arrow, the Avro Arrow, on the pretext of the diminished air threat from Russia, which had only a limited number of intercontinental bombers. So that decision threw 10,000 people off work, most of them specialists working on the saucer project, renamed the Avro car, by the way. It wasn't until August 1960 that American authorities decided to allow the press to see the prototype. Its performance was less than impressive. It managed to do a little more than just hover a few feet above ground, prompting the official statement that even for this type of vertical takeoff and landing plane, the principal problem was low speed stability. And if you follow the history down through, of course, Avro, Canada, slammed their doors shut, and everything was moved to Area 51 in the States. And you know as well as I do, Area 51 is the place where they introduced the crash landing and the aliens aboard the saucer. So the saucer was actually groundwork done here in Malton at Avro, perfected at Roswell, a fake crash set up, and that's where the alien whole mystique of extraterrestrials coming to Earth originated. Area 51. The show that follows this one, Coast to Coast, and Art Bell, made an entire career of selling that fact of interstellar travel by aliens in spaceships. You'll hear that show when this one leaves the air later tonight. And who knows, maybe that legend, mystic, purveyor of Illuminati ideas will be on. But you can see how it came from Germany through Frost at de Havilland in Britain, through to Avro, Canada, here in Malton, and then to Area 51, Roswell. And the alien piece of the puzzle was added. Spaceman back with more in a moment on AM 640 Toronto Radio, tackling the abductee topic next.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio. Mystery religions, numerous numerology, the holy grail decoded, and he goes deeper than a black hole in today's headlines. This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
I'm Space. It's A View from Space on AM 640, Toronto Radio. Never before handled the subject as a topic on the show of UFOs. Tonight is the very first time. I do think we are alone in the universes. I do think there are UFOs. I believe that they are being shown to a select few. And I've documented in the past 2 and a bit hours that they were started and researched and developed at the end of the Second World War with the Nazis and Hitler. With the V-1 rocket, the V-2 rocket, all the way up to the V-7. Does anybody know what the V stands for? Well, I'll tell you. The V stands for the Vril Society. The Vril Society is a luminous lodge combined with the political ideals of the Order of the Illuminati, with Hindu mysticism, also Theosophy, and the Kabbalah. The Vril Society is a secret society that had everything to do with solar worship, alien civilizations, and Atlantis. The Vril Society, the V rockets. Are you beginning to see through the haze? Now let's tackle the tough one. Save for the last hour on A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio. The abductions. Because any theory of the origin of UFOs must, of course, take into account all the available evidence, and this includes reported encounters with and descriptions of UFO occupants. After offering you proof positive that the UFOs are man-made aircraft, inspired by designs developed by Nazi scientists in the Second World War, and then finished off and perfected by the Western and Eastern powers of Russia and America and Britain. But what about the stories of people who claimed they were abducted by aliens inside flying saucers? What about extraterrestrial beings? Let's look at some alleged contacts with UFO occupants. Over the decades, since the modern era of UFOlogy began with the Arnold sighting in 1947 and the Trent sightings in 1947, people all over the world have claimed to have encountered an incredible variety of creatures linked with UFOs on the ground. In the 1950s and 1960s, these people were known as contactees, and according to their testimony, man's got nothing whatsoever to fear from these extraterrestrials. They're almost always described as being tall, strikingly attractive, with long, sandy-colored hair and blue eyes, description which resulted in their being called Nordic aliens. This was the first description of the aliens. Not the one we know today, the Greys. I'll get to that. The most famous of the 1950s contactees was George Adamansky, who on November 20th, 1952 encountered a man claiming to come from Venus. George Adamansky, a self-styled philosopher and mystic, give you a little hint right there, what's going on, was running a hamburger stand a few miles from the Mount Palomar Observatory in California when he encountered this being from Venus. He says he drove into the desert after telling his friends to stay behind, they allegedly saw this gigantic cigar-shaped object in the sky. He says he witnessed the landing of this disc-shaped scout craft. When the ship's single occupant appeared, Adamansky was able to communicate with him through a combination of hand signals and telepathy, and learned that the Venusians, together with other intelligent races throughout the solar system, were deeply concerned at humanity's misuse of nuclear energy, a theme that would be repeated again and again by these contactees, and of course put into all the television shows and the movies at the beginning. In common with the other contactees, Adamansky's claims suffered from egregious scientific inaccuracies. One of them was this inability of all the other planets in the solar system to support intelligent humanoid life. In Adamansky's case, this oversight got even bigger by a comment he made by two followers about prohibition. During this period, he had secured a special license from the government, it seems, to make wine for religious purposes. He found a monastery in Laguna Beach, with the result that he claimed to have made enough wine for all of Southern California. If it had not been for the repeal of prohibition, he told his friends, I wouldn't have to get into this stupid saucer crap. So it was a scam for him. The contactee, very famous Adamansky, claims of the 1950s are rightly regarded as extremely dubious by most ufologists. But in the decades since, there have been many contact claims that demand more serious attention. When you look at reports of encounters with UFO occupants, particularly since the early 60s, you see that they all have one thing in common, and that is the abduction, where witnesses are taken from their normal environment against their will and are forced to interact with various ways with apparently non-human entities. One of the most famous abduction cases happened on October 11th, 1973, on the shores of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. Charlie Hickson, Calvin Parker, fishing in the river when they witnessed the approach of a UFO. The following day, the United Press International News Service claimed this report. Two shipyard workers who claimed they were hauled aboard a UFO and examined by silver-skinned creatures with big eyes and pointed ears were checked today at a military hospital and found to be free of radiation. Jackson County Chief Deputy Barney Mathis said the men told him they were fishing from an old pier at the west bank of the Pascagoula River about 7 o'clock in the evening when they noticed a strange craft about a couple of miles away, emitting this bluish haze. They said it moved closer, and then it appeared to hover about 3 or 4 feet above the water. Then 3, whatever they were, came out, either floating or walking, and carried us into the ship. The officer quoted Hickson as saying, "The things had big eyes. They kept us about 20 minutes, photographed us, and then took us back to the pier. The only sound they made was a buzzing, humming sound. They left in a flash," they said. Sheriff Diamond said, "These are reliable people. They got no reason to say this wasn't happening and it wasn't true." He said the spacecraft was fish-shaped, about 10 feet long with an 8-foot ceiling. Occupants were said to have pale, silvery skin, no hair, long, pointed ears and noses with an opening for a mouth and hands like crab claws. Inside the UFO, the two men were placed on a table, examined with a device that resembled a huge eye. They were later interviewed by Dr. Alan Hynek, the astronomer whose work as a consultant for the United States Air Force UFO investigation project Blue Book turned him from skeptic to a believer. Hynek concluded that Hickson and Parker were in a state of genuine fright. Dr. James Harder, a consultant for the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, who also investigated that case, described the UFO occupants as automata, or advanced robots, judging from the witnesses' descriptions. A lot of people are skeptical of UFO and alien abductions, and quite reasonably that an advanced spacefaring civilization would not need to conduct the highly intrusive and traumatic experiments on human beings that their representatives are reported to contact. They repeatedly take samples of blood, flesh, sperm, ova from unwilling subjects. That implies a curiously primitive medical technology for beings allegedly capable of building interstellar spacecraft. But there is an intriguing correlation between the atrocities committed by these aliens on their human victims and those committed by the Nazi doctors in the concentration camps during the Second World War. This just may well be an ongoing and, for the moment, very highly secret Nazi plot to create a master race from the raw material of humanity in its present form, or build cyborgs. One of the most impressive and carefully investigated abduction cases happened on August 26, 1976. 4 art students, Charlie Fultz, Chuck Rack, and brothers Jack and Jim Viner, were on a camping trip on the Allagash River in Maine, the United States. While fishing in a boat on the East Lake, they watched the approach of a large spherical light that frightened them considerably. The next thing they knew, they were standing on the shore of the lake watching the object shoot up into the sky. There was nothing left of their blazing campfire, just a few glowing embers, implying that they had been away for several hours, although they only remember being on the lake for about 20 minutes. A few years later, the case came to the attention of the respected UFO researcher Raymond Fowler, who investigated on behalf of the Mutual Network for UFOs, the largest civilian UFO organization in the world. Fowler arranged for the 4 witnesses to go through this hypnotic regression to recover their lost memories of the evening. Each of the men, who had promised not to discuss with each other their individual hypnosis sessions, recalled being taken to the UFO through a beam of light. Once inside, they encountered several humanoid entities who forced them, apparently through some form of mind control, to undress and sit in a mist-filled room. Their bodies were examined, probed with various instruments. Samples of saliva, blood, skin, sperm, urine, feces were taken. When the examination had been completed, the men were forced to walk through a circular doorway. Once through, they found themselves floating back down to their boat through the light beam. Fowler later discovers that Jack Viner had had an anomalous lump surgically removed several years later. The pathologist who examined it was mystified at it. So it was sent for analysis. The Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. At Fowler's request, Jack Viner asked for his medical records and discovered that the lump had been sent to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington instead of the Center for Disease Control. When Fowler phoned the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology for an explanation, he was told the public information officer that the AFIP, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, occasionally assisted civilian doctors. So when Jack asked why the lump was sent to the Army rather than the Center for Disease Control, he was told his surgeon secretary that it was less costly, even though Jack was covered by insurance. The Pascagoula and Allagash encounters have the same hallmarks of the typical UFO abduction: initial appearance of the extraterrestrials and the taking of the abductees, medical probing, sexual activity, returning of the abductee to their normal environment. Next, the newest description of aliens called Greys, when I return on AM 640 Toronto Radio. This is A View from Space.
Deprogramming the brainwashed simply by uncovering the truth. He's the Spaceman with A View from Space. AM 640 Toronto Radio.
I'm a Spaceman. This is AM 640 Toronto Radio. Talking tonight about the mystery of the UFO. Actually, demystifying it and giving you positive proof that the machines are built by us. More precisely, research starting with the Nazis, playing into the hands of the Illuminati, and then spreading the technology to Russia and America and Britain, and building it from there. Now in this final hour, I just wanted to tackle the topic of the abductions, because that is also a large part of this phenomenon. And it's always the same. Initial appearance of the extraterrestrials and the taking of the abductee, then the medical probing with various instruments, machine examinations and mental testing, then sexual activity in which the abductee is sometimes forced to mate with other humans or even with the entity themselves, and then finally the return of the abductee to his or her normal environment. All 5 steps constantly repeated on all of the stories. It's all like a format, like a ritual. What's behind it? Listen. Although there's an extremely wide variety of alien types that have been encountered by people all over the world, one type in particular has become more and more commonly reported, particularly in North America, than any other. The so-called Grey is now seen as the quintessential alien being, and is one of the most immediately recognizable images in today's world. As a matter of fact, as I started the show off earlier this evening, I stated that possibly in the 20th century, one of the greatest icons is the flying saucer, the unidentified flying object. And I would say another icon of the 20th century, and now burgeoning into the 21st century, would be that instantly recognizable image that is burned into everyone's head. I mean, we are brainwashed to believe the alien looks this way. You say you don't know what I mean by what a Grey looks like? Yes, you do. The Grey's physical appearance looks like this. Usually described as approximately 4 feet tall, although some are as tall as 8 feet. With extremely large craniums, big head, enormous jet black almond-shaped eyes. There's your giveaway. They have no nose, no ears to speak of, merely small holes where they should be. Likewise, their mouths are usually described as no more than lipless slits. The torso and the limbs are described as being very thin, almost stick-like. And more than one abductee has reported the impression that they seem to be made of an undifferentiated material with no bone or muscular structure. Their hands are long and thin, sometimes with 3 fingers, sometimes with 4. Also, the Greys are always said to be rather uncaring in their attitude towards humans, treating the abductee like laboratory animals are treated. Like our scientists treat animals in a lab. They've also been described by some as militaristic and by others as hive-like in their behavior, as if they had no individual consciousness of their own, but were carrying out commands from a higher source. These greys or creatures may well be cyborgs. Well, what's a cyborg? Part human, part machine. I mean, haven't you seen the brainwashed movies of The Terminator? Arnold Schwarzenegger? The Bavarian? Now governor of California? They are biomedically engineered humans and machines. And you can't tell me that's impossible, because there are people around that are walking around with an artificial heart, artificial limbs. Heather Mills was dancing on Dancing with the Stars with one. This idea is purported to be a certain extent by medical research that's been carried out since the 1960s, mixing man and machine together, man and artificial parts. Although this research was at the time very highly secret, the gruesome details have since come to light in the form of books and articles that describe not only the nature of the experiments conducted, but also the frightening attitude of some members of the medical profession. According to Dave Fishhawk, even today there are people who believe that convicts, especially the criminal lunatic, and even conscientious objectors, should be compelled to lend themselves to science. Not long ago, I did the show in Virginia Tech with Cho, a definite Manchurian candidate. His mind was altered. What about altering a body? The direction that medical research has been going in for more than 30 years now, that probably was started in the Nazi concentration camps with the doctors like Mengele and his experiments, move into the area of artificial organs. Not only medical specialists, but mechanical, electrical, chemical, and biomedical engineers, as well as biochemists and polymer chemists, are busy in operating theaters, enthusiastically engaged in surgery connected to the development of artificial substitutes for vital organs like the liver, lungs, pancreas, kidneys. And how about this big push that's on for donor, organ donor? How about that? Looking for spare parts? Can you put it past them? Can you say, no, every single one of these organs that we get is going to someone and will give them a better life? It's always for our own good, remember. What about for projects that are their pet projects, like making and actually constructing an alien to fool you completely and totally when the time comes to unveil them? It's not beyond the realm of possibility, and it's probably more likely than it is to not be. I mean, after all, look at the horrendous things they've done. Cyborgs, greys, aliens. All emanating from the Area 51 so-called extraterrestrial spaceship crash, where they discovered the extraterrestrials. What a hoax. Back with more in a moment. It's AM 640, Toronto Radio, Spaceman.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640 Toronto Radio. He goes deeper into today's headlines than anyone else dares to go. But can you take it? This is A View from Space with the Spaceman. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
It's Spaceman on AM 640, Toronto Radio. Speaking about abductions in UFOs and what's behind it. And who's to say that they aren't real? That these abductees are actually being taken aboard machines that we have never seen, but have proof that they may exist because of the technology that's gone before it, and what they obviously would have now. And that these experiments, or these tampering with these human beings aboard, are nothing more than a highly secretive continuation of the Nazi practices in the concentration camps during World War II, only now done cleverly concealed as alien abductions. You have to admit, it is conceivable. After all, if man can think it, someone will try it. So, as I was saying, the direction of the medical research that's been going on for more than 30 years, especially in artificial organs and transplants. And why do you think, for a moment, why they try to separate twins that are born in that are connected at the head? They don't do it to try and save the lives of them. The medical profession does it to learn from it. That's really what they're all about. I don't believe for a moment it's about giving them a better life. Although that may be a consequence of their work. But I think first and foremost they are actually, I think doctors today, the vast majority, it's all about the knowledge. Very few people, I believe, go to medical college today because they want to help people. I believe because they want to make money. And fewer are going into it because you don't make as much money as you used to. But this organ donation thing gives me the creeps too. There's a huge push for it, to the point where, okay, we're taking anything we need from your body as soon as you die, if you didn't say don't. And maybe in some cases, even when they said they don't, they do anyway. I mean, how do you know what they do with your body once you're dead? What, is your mom going to check, see if you're all there? I don't think so. How do they know what was missing? My first apprentice job was with an undertaker. I took it for about 3 days. See ya. Not going to hang around dead people all my life. Can't get there. But just take everything out of you. If they throw it away, or they save it, who's to know? So there's been a lot of great interest going as far back as 1967 in the possibility of transferring the entire head of one human being to another. That's their dream now. Switching human brains from one head to another would be complicated and costly, but by simply switching heads, only a few connections need to be severed and then reestablished in the neck of the recipient body. And you may be sitting back going, this is the most absurd thing I have ever heard you say, Space. AM 640, Toronto Radio, A View from Space. But this procedure was already successfully carried out on monkeys. Yeah, they have already done it at a Cleveland clinic. Each head apparently retaining its own original mental characteristics, too, when it attached to its new body. In other words, if a monkey had been aggressive before the operation, it would remain that way when its head was transplanted to another body. The eyes of the monkey followed the people as they walked past, too, implying that the heads retained some level of awareness. The experiments of these procedures on these monkeys only lived for about a week, but the fact remains these ideas are being not just thought about, but being carried out. Already did it with monkeys. It's the same thing with such stem cell research. Do you actually think the Illuminati is sitting back going, ooh, this is too unethical. Can't do this. Of course not. They're thinking things like, well, the main problem in a procedure of this kind would be the regeneration of the severed spinal cord so that the brain could send nerve impulses to its body. As a matter of fact, June 1976, a Soviet scientist named Levon Medlin reported from the 4th Biennial Conference on Regeneration of the Central Nervous System that he had succeeded in regrowing the spinal cords of rats. How? Stem cell research. That's the answer. Without a doubt. If you can think it, these people will try it. This area of research is continued behind closed doors at military and scientific establishments, all controlled by the elite rich. Sure, it's reasonable to suppose that if this is the case, scientists have progressed well beyond the level of rats and are looking for a human being to do it on. You can't help but what conceivable use such barbaric experiments could possibly have for humanity. What is mercifully unlikely is that head transplants will never really be in vogue or popular, but the research undoubtedly holds a lot of potential for the enhancement of human beings who will eventually conduct routine work in hostile environments, like walking on the ocean floor, or maybe outer space, or maybe fusion of a sort between human and machine, which has already been achieved in the form of the so-called cybernetic anthropomorphous machine system. Slave machinery that mimics the movement of human operators. In an aerospace conference given in Boston in 1966, engineer William Bradley, who developed the idea of cable-less man-machine manipulator systems for the United States Department of Defense Institute for Defense Analysis, stated his belief that man and machine would eventually be linked in such a way that by performing the maneuvers himself, the man could cause them to take place through a machine at a distance of thousands of miles. This concept led to the weapon aiming system devised by the Philco Corporation for the United States Air Force, where the pilot's helmet is coupled with a computer system that allows him to aim and fire his weapon automatically by merely swiveling his head until a camera located in his helmet shows the target. So it's already happening. How about this? They make an alien because these saucers can move at such an incredible rate of speed. Make an alien out of a human being that can actually withstand that kind of G-force. Because right now, the average United States Air Force pilot or Canadian Air Force pilot gets into a cockpit of an F-18, he can't push that airplane to its capacity, right to its envelope, because his body cannot stand it. The machines are getting past the capability of the human body to withstand the G-force. Then how about Illuminati thinking here? How about restructuring a body that can withstand the G-force? As well, excuse me, as early as 1967, United States Air Force scientists succeeded in transmitting thought impulses to a computer using a variation on Morse code composed of long and short bursts of alpha waves. Alpha waves, by the way, are produced by the brain when it's at rest. This technology has developed to the point where today we have the potential for amputees to control their prosthetic limbs by means of nerve impulses directly from the brain. Are they that far away from engineering a cyborg? Have they already? Is this the alien invasion spoken about by Werner von Braun on his deathbed? Space back with more in a moment on AM 640 with a closing segment on A View from Space.
You're listening to A View from Space with the Spaceman exercising the right to free speech while he still can. AM 640, Toronto Radio.
UFOs, alien abductions, aliens, all covered tonight on A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio. You can email me your thoughts if you got them, if you got information. Space at 640toronto.com or spaceman at 640toronto.com. You know, in the field of organ transplants, we've seen incredible progress over the last 30 years, and it's certainly not rash to suggest that we will soon see common artificial hearts, common other organs routinely replacing those damaged through illness or accident, be commonplace. Almost cannibalistic, isn't it? To think some guy in China speaks out against the government there, ends up in prison, and they sell his liver to somebody in Homestead, Florida. That's what goes on in places that are out of control. Places that have no rights for human beings. How far are we away from really having about the same rights as that guy who speaks up against the government in China? Because if your local authorities have their way you're going to have to say something, or they're going to be like a Tomb Raider and take everything out of your body they want. Then there's just one little step extra that could be so quickly taken. They take the organ before you're dead. Yeah, because you're in a compromised position. Yeah, because maybe you're in a mental institution. Well, yeah, maybe you need emergency surgery. You're in jail. Oh my God, you went back there with only one kidney. But you don't know. You just had emergency surgery. And they're telling you everything will be fine. It's not like you can go into your pocket and check to see if both your kidneys are there. So it's that fine line. Not a lot of difference between China and our side of the world where things are going. And likewise, in spite of concerns with the ethical implications of human cloning, we may also see the day when human organs are produced in the laboratory, ready for transplanting when the need comes. In view of the fact that research conducted under the aegis of national security is between 10 and 20 years ahead of what is made public at any particular time. For instance, work on the stealth fighter began in the mid-70s through the public, was only made aware in the late 80s. It's possible, perhaps, likely, that advocates in the field of medical and bioengineering research have already extended into the realm of what the public would consider science fiction. I believe that what the public knows is merely the tip of the iceberg and reminds us that the United States Navy, Air Force, Army, government agencies like NASA, all the top secret research establishments in the White Sands Proving Ground and similar areas have a particular need for advanced man-machine manipulations, or cyborgs. The creatures seen in and around landed UFOs could be these cyborgs. Human beings, radically changed, fixed up, fitted by sophisticated mechanical prosthetics. When you think about it, theoretically, the lungs of these creatures would be partially collapsed, and the blood in them artificially cooled. The cyborg's respiration and other bodily functions would then be controlled cybernetically with artificial lungs and sensors which maintain constant temperature, metabolism, and pressure. Doesn't matter what the external environmental fluctuations or forces are. So, even if not protected by any anti-gravity or propulsion system, they would not be affected by the extraordinary accelerations and direction changes of, say, a flying saucer, a spacecraft. Something that could be in view 1 second and gone the next. Let me put it into an area where you can understand it. When Captain Kirk turns to his man on duty on the bridge in Star Trek and says, "Warp factor 5. Let's go." The cyborgs would have no independent will. They could be remote controlled, both physically and mentally, even across great distances, by computer-linked brain implants. Since this operation would render the mouth and nose unneeded, those would be sealed and completely non-functioning. If we remember the basic description of the Greys I described earlier, with their slit-like and apparently useless mouths, slits for noses and thin torsos, we can begin to see a frightening correspondence with the theoretical human-built cyborg, a nightmarish combination of genetically engineered humanity and highly sophisticated machinery, to a startled, disorientated, terrified UFO witness. A creature looking like this would surely look like nothing on Earth. In fact, it would look like an extraterrestrial alien. It's conceivable that the humans, or Nordic aliens seen by abductees on board UFOs, are actually the controllers of those Greys and cyborgs. It's also conceivable that these humans are members of an ultra-secret group existing completely independently of any nation on Earth and hostile to all nations and all humans on Earth. They are the Illuminati. I'm Space. This has been A View from Space on AM 640 Toronto Radio.